remember saying to the missus on the first run out, I've heard of Dam Wall, but this is the first time I've seen it.
It's one of the few places where you can stand in one spot and see the curvature of the earth.
Yeah, we are out in the middle of nowhere, that's for sure.
The Nullarbor Plain is a land that should probably only exist in fiction. Seemingly stretching from one infinity to another, it is an area that has daunted travellers for millennia. To the local Aboriginal population, the land was known as Undiri, quite literally meaning the waterless. After the arrival of the British colonists, the current name of Nullarbor was adopted, derived from the Latin words of nullus and arbor, translating as no trees. Both waterless and treeless, these names are apt. Covering an area almost the size of the state of Victoria, this land acted as a barrier between the eastern and western halves of Australia. It was a barrier that would almost permanently separate Australia in two. Prior to Federation in 1901, the colony of Western Australia was reluctant to join in the new planned nation. The offer of a railway crossing the waterless and treeless plain would encourage Western Australia to become a part of the new Commonwealth of Australia. It was a political promise, but one that would come to fruition in what would become Australia's first major engineering project. Over 1,000 miles of railway, running from Port Augusta in South Australia to Kalgoorlie in Western Australia, would be laid through some of the harshest land on the planet. The Nullarbor Plain, being so flat and barren, presented a unique challenge to the surveyors who had to find a route for the railway. There were no significant natural features to use as a point of reference, so like ancient sailors at sea, they used the stars to help plot their course. The alignment they surveyed would include the longest straight stretch of railway in the world, 478 kilometres or 297 miles without a curve. There was no surface water nor equipment that could be found on the plain. Everything needed for both the construction crews and the railway itself would have to be brought in. It was out of this necessity that an Outback legend would be born.
It's the lifeblood, it's the opportunity to communicate, and it creates the, if you like, the big community across a very vast space.
As the rail steadily reached across the wilderness, the enormous logistical challenges already mentioned were compounded by the most basic of human needs: food. Beyond Port Augusta and Kalgoorlie, there were no supplies available for the hungry track gangs. Food and water would have to be brought in alongside track building materials. The use of Roberts Brothers track layers, imported from the United States, would add further supply challenges. These machines rapidly increased the speed track could be laid, helping break construction records in the process. This meant that the railheads were quickly moving further away from town centres and deeper into the outback wilderness. Initially, local traders at both ends of the line were engaged to supply everything required to support the construction effort. The ever-growing logistical demands, combined with a growing dissatisfaction at the supplies being charged at for-profit prices, would encourage the Commonwealth Railways to take over the operation and distribution of basic essential services in-house. In particular, a focus was made on ensuring goods and services were supplied at cost to the railway staff and their families, with no additional profit markups. The first railway store, a simple canvas tent, was initially set up at the railhead. As the project advanced, the tent was replaced with a small galvanised iron building, but the necessity to constantly move the structure became impractical. From 1915 onwards, several freight wagons were converted to ferry supplies once a week from Port Augusta to the railhead. Known as mobile provisions vans, these mobile stores would be supplied from a permanent supply base in Port Augusta. In addition, permanent settlements were being established alongside the railway to house staff dedicated to either track or locomotive maintenance. Stores for the staff, run by the railways, were established initially at Wookilla, Kingunya and Tarcoola, with others later appearing at Cook, Rawlinna and Parkston. These stores would send out supplies to the railway staff living in between these locations via the mobile provisions vans. Prices for all groceries were fixed to match those sold in Adelaide, the South Australian state capital. Additionally, prices were uniform across the length of the railway. This coordinated system of both fixed and mobile stores across the desert would almost immediately be known by railway staff as the Tea and Sugar Train. Once the Trans-Australia Railway had been completed in 1917, the newly established service would continue to operate, supplying the long string of desert communities established beside the line. Over time, the Tea and Sugar name would make its way into the pages of official railway reports. The train's identity was assured. Developed out of necessity in the Outback dust, an Australian railway legend was born.
The train is the village store, the bank, and the health centre for the rail workers and others living along the 1,100-mile track between Port Augusta and Kalgoorlie.
As the new railway store system was developed during the construction phase of the Trans-Australia Railway, the early rolling stock required for the Tea and Sugar Train would have to be improvised from equipment already available. To begin with, 6 small brake vans and 1 flat wagon, provided with a timber boxcar-like body, were used as provisions vans. These would supply general groceries, fresh produce, dairy items and baked goods. These were, however, a temporary solution and would only last a few years in traffic. In 1920, 2 converted provisions vans would emerge from Port Augusta workshops. Once again, these were built on standard flat wagon underframes. These vans would include living quarters for the storemen, shelves for groceries, a bread bin with a capacity of 400 loaves, and a vented section for perishable items. Although the supply of foodstuffs was the most pressing concern, the Tea and Sugar Train would also provide other services to the communities alongside the track. This included the distribution of both pay and general banking services. To supply this need during the construction phase, what was dubbed as a pay and inspection van was assembled in 1915, once again using a standard flat wagon underframe. Like the early provisions vans, this was only a temporary solution as a permanent pay van was placed into service around 1918. The new pay van was split into 2 halves. One end contained cooking and sleeping facilities, while the other end had a safe, office tables, storage cupboards, and additional sleeping bunks. Meat supplies would require some unique equipment. In the days before widespread refrigeration, the long distances covered in hot weather would potentially render pre-prepared meat unusable by the time it was delivered to the community. The solution to this was the butcher's van. 2 butcher's vans were assembled in 1918 to meet this need. 2 wagons, one being a timber van or boxcar and 1 sheep wagon, were both effectively cut in half and the bodies matched up to create 2 butcher's vans. Livestock would be slaughtered and pre-prepared on the move between stations, ensuring fresh meat was supplied at each township. Unlike the rest of the train, which was crewed with railway staff, the butcher was an individual contractor who would source the livestock in addition to pre-preparing the cuts of meat en route. Space for meat sales and accommodation for the butcher were also provided. In addition to the dedicated provisions, butchers and pay vans, regular freight wagons such as water tank cars and covered vans would also be used. The water tank cars would supply drinking water to local town reservoirs, while the vans would be used to move larger personal items and general goods. For example, when a member of staff and their family would move from one community to another, they would pack all of their belongings onto the Tea and Sugar Train, effectively becoming a personalised railway moving service. Finally, a passenger carriage or 2 and a brake van would be attached for local use. From the early 1920s onwards, this motley collection of carriages and wagons would form the early Tea and Sugar Train.
It's the only contact we have with the outside world, as we're pretty well isolated.
And you look forward to it coming every week?
Yes, it's one of the highlights of the week actually.
As the years rolled on, the Tea and Sugar Train would grow and evolve as needs dictated and new equipment became available. The original 1918 built butcher's vans, while effective for their unique function, were also primitive. By the early 1940s, refrigeration technology had advanced to a point that new butcher's vans could be built that would eliminate the need to slaughter livestock while in transit. The Commonwealth Railway's workshops in Port Augusta would be given the task of building these new vehicles. Entering service in 1944, these vans were a major advance on the earlier vehicles. 2 interconnected refrigerated compartments were provided at one end of the van for hanging meat. Power for the refrigeration equipment was provided by an 8 horsepower Lister engine, driving the condensing gear via belts. Sun shields and a double roof helped provide additional protection against the desert conditions. Further along the car was a meat preparation area, complete with a butcher's block and a serving window. Finally, sleeping and living quarters were provided at the other end of the butcher's van. In the early 1950s, the distinctive butcher's vans would be joined by 2 new provisions vans, bringing a new standard of service to the tea and sugar train. Most importantly, a refrigerated cool room for the transport of perishable items was incorporated. A generator set was fitted at one end of the car to provide power for the refrigeration equipment. A general merchandise storeroom, serving counter, and living quarters for the store person were also a part of the design. These all-steel cars were constructed by Commonwealth Engineering in Sydney, with the final fit-out being performed at Port Augusta workshops. Despite being ordered in 1953, post-war material shortages, however, would delay the delivery of the provisions vans until late 1955. These vans, along with the aforementioned butcher's vans, would help define the classic image of the tea and sugar train, not only to the people of the Nullarbor, but to the nation as a whole. Following the introduction of diesel locomotives to the Trans-Australia Railway, it became necessary to ensure that adequate supplies of diesel fuel were provided along the line. The tea and sugar train would be used to transport fuel and tank wagons along the line from the main storage point in Port Pirie. These facilities were placed into operation during 1952. In addition to locomotive use, diesel fuel would also be used to supply local town power plants. 10 dedicated tank wagons for this purpose were delivered between 1952 and 1953. The health of the families living on the railway was always a matter of key concern to the Commonwealth Railways. Between 1918 and 1922, 2 dedicated hospital vans were located beside the line at Tarcoola and Rawlinna to provide medical services. In the 1950s, however, the delivery of medical services would become directly tied to the tea and sugar train story. At the suggestion of the Department of Health in Western Australia, a spare 1915-built passenger car was modified to become a travelling baby health clinic, supplying medical support to both mothers and their children. Nursing staff from Western Australia would be made available to staff this carriage, which entered service in 1954. The newly converted carriage would almost immediately gain a second use. Ever since the construction of the line, the spiritual nourishment of the railway staff and their families had been catered for with travelling church leaders visiting the construction camps and later townships. It had been suggested several times over the intervening years that provision for a travelling chapel be attached to the tea and sugar train service. As the newly converted travelling baby health clinic would make the journey once every 3 months, the car could be made available at other times of the year. From 1955, church leaders from 2 denominations would provide spiritual nourishment from on board the train. In light of the new dual use of the carriage, it was officially referred to as the community welfare car. During the early 1960s, another service would be offered on the tea and sugar train. Using a 1907-built passenger car that had previously been used by both the Victorian and South Australian Railways, a mobile movie cinema was created. While the permanent residents living beside the Trans-Australia Railway were a hardy breed, who knew how to entertain themselves in the outback wilderness, the newly created mobile Fairtrack car was a welcome and much appreciated addition. With the arrival of new equipment better suited for the desert conditions and more services being offered, the tea and sugar train would roll on, serving the people of the Trans-Australia Railway. However, the modernisation of the tea and sugar train would occur alongside a steady development of the railway itself. New infrastructure and equipment would continue to arrive, strengthening the transcontinental link across Australia. Little by little, however, these changes would bring about the eventual downfall of the tea and sugar.
What sort of future do you think it's got?
The sugar, not a great deal, I'm afraid. They'll have to run some sort of service out here, but it'll probably end up like the Northline vans. It's just container vans and they were in.
In a climate of extremes, the efficient operation of train services on the Trans-Australia Railway was always a matter of importance to the Commonwealth Railways. At the end of the Second World War, it was clear that the old way of doing things would no longer suffice. It was time to modernise. In 1951, the Commonwealth Railways would introduce their first mainline diesel-electric locomotives to their roster. Between September 1951 and July 1952, 11 GM-class locomotives were introduced to service, enabling the 47 operational steam locomotives in use at that time to be almost completely removed from mainline service. The new diesels meant a whole day could be shaved off of train schedules, while frequent coal and water stops, a necessity with steam traction, could be eliminated. This also meant that the multiple steam locomotive depots located at Tarcoola, Cook and Rawlinna could also be closed, with the now redundant staff being transferred to either Port Augusta workshops or on the narrow gauge Central Australia Railway. This would cause a population decline on the Trans-Australia Railway and consequently a reduced demand on the tea and sugar train. While there was a reduction in staff owing to the introduction of diesel traction, the enormous army of people employed to maintain the track and manage the local station still had to be provided for. The tea and sugar train would continue to roll on. Although the introduction of diesel-electric locomotives had revolutionised operations on the Trans-Australia Railway, it was becoming clear that the infrastructure around the trains would need to be modernised as well. Aside from routine maintenance, the track work on the Trans-Australia Railway had changed relatively little since the line was initially built. The original 80 pound per yard or 40 kilogram per metre rails were still in use along the 1,108 miles or 1,783 kilometres from Port Pirie to Kalgoorlie. This enormous quantity of rail was mechanically bolted together for the entire length of the railway, creating the classic clickety-clack sound for the entire journey. Additionally, the sleepers or ties, all 2.5 million of them, were entirely timber. It was clear that a major investment would be required to modernise the track and bring it up to a more modern standard. In 1950, work would commence on building a new standard gauge railway from Port Augusta to Lee Creek and Maree in the far north of South Australia, replacing the narrow gauge portion of the Central Australia Railway running through the Flinders Ranges. While not directly related to the Trans-Australia Railway, the new line would set a new standard of track construction for the Commonwealth Railways. Heavy 94 pound per yard or 47 kilogram per metre rail was welded into continuous lengths and transported to site. The advantages of using continuously welded rail were immense, providing both a smoother ride and eliminating the additional maintenance required by the traditional track joints. A new rail welding facility was established in Port Augusta and was opened in October 1952, initially supplying rails for the new standard gauge line to Maree, but also for the Trans-Australia Railway. Work to relay the track commenced in the late 1950s, but the enormity of the task meant that the project would take years to complete. The project, however, would take on a newfound importance during the early 1960s. In 1962, work commenced on building a new standard gauge link across Australia. Alongside the rebuilding of the Trans-Australia Railway, the narrow gauge lines between Kalgoorlie and Perth in Western Australia and Port Pirie to Broken Hill in South Australia and New South Wales were both replaced with a new standard gauge route. This national undertaking would add extra impetus to the Trans-Australia Railway reconstruction program, although the project wouldn't be complete until 1973, 3 years after the coast-to-coast standard gauge link had been commissioned. The benefits were immediate, with thousands of mechanical track joints eliminated and faster and heavier trains now running smoothly through the desert. It wasn't just the rails that were receiving attention during this time. Nearly 2.5 million timber sleepers, or ties, were used when the line was built, mostly from hardwood like karri or jarrah. While these were some of the finest Australian timbers available for railway use, the harsh climate of the Nullarbor Plain meant that replacing sleepers was a constant task. Not only was it necessary to replace thousands of sleepers every year, but the track relaying program would only see the number of sleepers increase as a means of strengthening the roadbed. Harder than replacing sleepers, though, was the need to constantly find new staff to maintain the track. In 1957, 52 individual track gangs of 6 people each were employed on the line. The extremes of both climate and isolation meant that employee turnover was extremely high. For those who would stay, replacing sleepers was a constant task. The costs of regular sleeper replacement, recruiting and retaining staff, and providing the required housing, all in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, meant that the maintenance costs were an area of key consideration. What was needed was a railway sleeper that could withstand both the desert environment and have a longer service life than the current timber ones. The answer was concrete. In 1960, on a siding at Wirrapa, an experiment would take place. 19 experimental concrete sleepers of Swedish design were installed. By mid-1963, over 3,600 concrete sleepers of 7 different types, including 2 developed in-house by the Commonwealth Railways, had been installed for trial purposes. The advantages of concrete sleepers were immense, being stronger, rot-proof, and having a lifespan of up to 50 years in service. It was clear that this was the way forward. Concrete sleepers wouldn't become a permanent part of the Trans-Australia Railway straight away though. Further experiments and refinements were needed to make a concrete sleeper design suitable for full-scale Australian production. Additionally, the rail replacement project on the line was just one task being undertaken by the Commonwealth Railways during the 1960s. Planning was underway for a new branch line running from Port Augusta to the steel city of Whyalla in South Australia. Additionally, early designs for a new standard gauge railway to Alice Springs, replacing the old narrow gauge Central Australia Railway, were in development. The Trans-Australian line would have to wait a little while longer. Opening in 1972, the Whyalla line would be the first railway in Australia to entirely use concrete sleepers. It would be a great success and would prove beyond any shadow of doubt that this was the future of track construction in Australia. After over 10 years of design and development, it was time for the concrete age on the Trans-Australia Railway to begin. In May 1974, production started on 200,000 new sleepers to be used between Port Pirie and Port Augusta. The concrete re-sleepering project would take years to complete, with the Australian National Railways Commission taking over the task following its formation in 1975. Slowly but surely, a new railway was rising out of the desert sands, taking this transcontinental link into a new era. A new era was starting, but it also meant that another one would slowly come to an end. The arrival of nearly maintenance-free concrete sleepers and continuously welded rail would steadily eat away at the need for the tea and sugar train. It would continue to run during this period, but it was now clear that time was starting to run out.
They used to have a butcher van on that. Well, that was a mongrel thing when you have to fuel it up top and the fuel will go all over the top of you. We're glad to see the last bit.
Times were definitely changing, but the tea and sugar train would continue to change with them, especially as more modern equipment became available. By the early 1970s, the community welfare car, being both timber-bodied and unair-conditioned, was showing its age. However, a modern replacement was being worked on. Entering service in 1973, the new community service car started out as a sleeper and lounge car used on the Trans-Australia passenger service. Built in 1952 by Wegmann in Germany, the newly converted car would continue to offer the same services as the old one, but would do so with the benefit of air conditioning and more modern facilities. 1973 would also see work commence on the conversion of 2 new provisions vans. Advances in refrigeration and food packaging technology would allow these new vehicles to combine the functions of both the existing provisions van and the butcher's van all into one car. The vehicles selected for this task were unique. Built in 1928 by Pullman in the United States, these 2 cars were imported to Australia for use on the overland train service between Adelaide and Melbourne. In the United States, these cars were generally known as heavyweights. This was a fitting title indeed, as the cars weighed over 76 tonnes and featured a floor partially made of concrete to improve stability at speed. These 2 sleeping cars, named Macedon and Mount Lofty, were magnificent, but their enormous bulk made them expensive to operate compared to local equipment. These 2 cars would spend periods both in and out of service. Between 1950 and 1964, they would be sold to the Commonwealth Railways. From 1973 onwards, Port Augusta workshops would convert these cars to become what were known as retail stores vans. Compared to the previous provisions vans, these would feature a more modern self-serve layout akin to a regular suburban supermarket.
We have margarine, chickens, coon cheese and toilet paper. This is what you want special.
Additionally, refrigeration and freezer space was provided, which would allow for pre-packaged meat supplies to be transported. Like the previous provisions vans, sleeping, living and power generation facilities were incorporated at one end of the car. The conversion of the two Pullman heavyweights for tea and sugar train service would be a drawn-out affair. Work had commenced in 1973, but a combination of funding difficulties and more urgent priorities meant that it wouldn't be until 1979 that the freshly rebuilt retail stores vans would enter service with Australian National. After nearly 40 years of service, the two Butchers vans were retired in 1982, while the 1950s provisions vans would be written off in 1985 and 1986. Aside from these conversions, Australian National would periodically provide other vehicles for service on the tea and sugar train. From 1991, a former South Australian Railways baggage van was adapted to become a rolling activity hall. Finally, in 1992, the two retail stores vans would be augmented with 4 provision storage vans, providing additional storage space for essential supplies. These were converted from former South Australian Railways brake vans, which had been rendered surplus with the introduction of 2-person train crews. For their new role, additional insulation and ventilation were added, along with other minor changes. These would be the final additions to the tea and sugar train though. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the march of the concrete sleeper across the Outback had been slow but steady. With each passing year, the gap between sleepers had been closing, and with it, it would be the end of the line for the tea and sugar train.
Yeah, what would you do without the tea and sugar?
We'd be buggered.
When the Trans-Australia Railway was opened in 1917, 53 communities were established to serve both the trains and the railway itself. As the years rolled by, more efficient operating practices and the introduction of diesel locomotives meant that by the mid-1950s, the number of townships served by the tea and sugar train had dropped to 34. This steady decline would accelerate dramatically during the second half of the 20th century. As discussed previously, the introduction of heavier rail welded into continuous lengths and concrete sleepers would reduce the volume of maintenance required, and as a result, reduce the number of staff needed. One by one, camps in towns besides the railway would close. Places like Denman, Alday and Hughes would slowly fade into history. By 1987, only 9 communities were still being served by the tea and sugar train. The project to install the concrete sleepers was an enormous undertaking, with the sheer distances to be covered and remote working conditions making the task an arduous slog. Having commenced in 1974, it would take 20 years to completely re-sleeper the track, with up to 250,000 sleepers being inserted per year. By 1994, Australian National had completed the task, and for the few remaining people living beside the line, the end was nigh. In a weird twist of fate, the tea and sugar train would aid in its own demise, regularly being used to transport the new concrete sleepers to wherever they were needed. The tea and sugar train was an institution, the lifeline of the Outback. It was, however, an institution born out of necessity, and it would sadly die out of necessity. The original need to feed and service the people of the communities along the track was no longer there. It was the end of the line for the tea and sugar. The last train would rattle its way out of Port Augusta on the 28th of August 1996, departing Parkson for the final eastbound run on the 30th of that month. The demise of the tea and sugar train would also mean the end of the last settlements on the railway, like Tarcoola and Cook in South Australia. For the remaining staff at these locations, it was naturally a time of great personal anxiety. In the years since the cessation of the tea and sugar train service, the need to deliver diesel fuel and carriage water to the resupply point at Cook remained and still continues to the present. Today, train services run by Pacific National, who manages the town of Cook, still stop there to take on additional fuel. In addition, the Indian Pacific passenger service has the water tanks on the train replenished here. Both fuel and water are regularly transported by train to Cook, with dedicated tank wagons being attached at Port Augusta to regular freight services going west. Other freight services run by other companies, however, are provided with additional fuel storage tanks known as inline fueling, which allows for the locomotives at the front to refuel while on the move. The train servicing facilities, station building and crew barracks in Cook are looked after by town caretakers. Today, the permanent population of the town now hovers between 3 and 11 people. Cook was one of the main centres served by the tea and sugar train, and today, sitting in the quiet space of the Nullarbor, it continues to be served by the passing trains. A small piece of the tea and sugar train legacy lives on. While the tea and sugar train service is now a part of history, some of the rolling stock used is still very much with us. The original timber community welfare cart from 1955 is today a part of the Wadlutta Outback Centre in Port Augusta, now used as a display to tell the history of the Trans-Australia Railway. The two Pullman heavyweight cars, converted to retail store vans by 1979, have both survived and are now located in Victoria. One, now known once again as Macedon, has been restored and runs on the Victorian Goldfields Railway as a beautifully appointed parlour car. Its sister, Mount Lofty, is awaiting a similar restoration. At the National Railway Museum in Port Adelaide, South Australia, a replica tea and sugar train consist has been assembled and is on display. A timber-covered van, the 1944 Butcher's van, the 1955 Provisions van, a 1971 Paymasters van and a 1971 Relay van have been combined and lovingly restored, preserving both the history and memory of the tea and sugar train for future generations to admire long into the future. In Australia, there have been many famous train services that have now passed into history. Trains with names like the Spirit of Progress, the Sunlander, the Tasman Limited or the Westland. The tea and sugar train may not have been as glamorous as these examples, but it is just as fondly remembered. It was a train that not only served the people of the Outback, it became a vital part of those very same communities. It was their link between both each other and the outside world. This has been Outback Lifeline, the tea and sugar story.